So here's the fun bit of Resolve, the colour panel. This is where we get to make all of our colour adjustments, and we'll spend most of our time here once we've set up our project. The colour panel contains all of our colour grading tools, and we'll quickly go over where to find them. Now, before we do anything else, click on Workspace up here, and then click on Reset UI Layout. That will make sure that we're all looking at the same thing, and it'll help you make sense of this video. And one more note. If you're working on a laptop, then things will be slightly different. Resolve's GUI is at its best on a 2.5K screen. If you're working on a smaller monitor, then a few of these windows may be hidden behind icons which expand. So, in the dead center here, we have our viewer. This is where the currently active frame under our playhead is displayed. This is much the same as the viewer from the edit page, and this is where we'll see the changes we make as we work. To the right, we have the node tree. This is where we organize our grade on any particular shot. The diagram here shows us a map of all the adjustments we've made and the order in which they are applied to our starting image. I'll go over how to use the node tree and organize a grade in a later lecture. This window can also show us our effects library in the color panel. To the far left, we have the stills gallery. We can grab a still frame from our grade and use it to compare to other shots. We'll also use stills to communicate with our clients during the real-world projects. As well as stills, we also have what we call power grades here, which are stills saved and made available to all projects. This is a recent reinstall of Resolve, so I've wiped all of my power grades. Below this, we have the shot list. This shows all of our shots on the timeline from left to right in a logical order. We can change the shot we're working on by using either the up and down arrow keys, or by clicking on the thumbnail of the shot we want to work on in this list. Just below this, we have our timeline. This is a representation of our actual edit timeline and shows us where we are as well as how many multiple shots may be aligned when dealing with buried or composite clips. Below this, we have our tools and scope windows. The left window shows us our primary tools, the center window shows us our secondary tools and blur and sharpen as well as pan and scan, and the right window shows us our scopes and our keyframing and animation interface in the color panel. We'll cover keyframing in a later lecture. This was a good and a fast overview of the color page. We're about to go through all of it in much greater detail, so click on through to the next lecture when you're ready. Okay, so we're making some real progress in the color panel, but before we can move on and do any of the fun stuff like working on our images, what we have to be able to do is read our images accurately. Because just going by a UI monitor or a gaming monitor or a monitor that is built into a laptop is not enough. When we work with color accurately, we need to be able to use what we call the scopes in order to make mathematically accurate readings of our images. So we're going to look at the scopes here. Now, if you don't see an interface like this, and by default Resolve's interface can be a little cluttered on small screens, it is designed for 2.5K monitors and up, then we can go up to Workspace here and we can choose Reset UI Layout and then just give that a left click. And that will make sure that we are all looking at the same thing. Please note that if you are on a laptop and you have a smaller monitor, you might only see the color wheels in the lower left to begin with. You might not see the curve and all these spikes in the center, but all of these tools are accessible, and we will go over how to find them later on. So the first thing we need to be able to do is that we need to be able to read contrast accurately. So we're going to go over what the Luma waveform is, how to access it, and then how to read it whilst looking at our image. Now, the next few lectures have a load of gradients in because they're the easiest way to demonstrate how these scopes work. So I want to expose my Luma waveform scope in the lower right of my screen. I have my keyframes interface exposed right now, which will be here by default, and there are 3 blurred diamonds here in the right hand side of the screen. Next to that is what looks like a little seismograph or a little zigzag on an XY axis. I give that a click and my scopes turn up. Now, the default scope is the parade scope, which we will cover in the next lecture, but it's a little bit more advanced than what we need right now. So where it says parade, I click, and from the drop-down menu, I simply choose Waveform. And then I get a scope with a diagonal line going straight across now by default. This one can be difficult to read on a full colour image. So next to the waveform and the drop-down menu, we have a little abacus icon here. And if I click this, I get access to all kinds of settings. I can choose to look at individual colour channels. I can choose to look at horizontal and vertical chrominance. I can choose to look at all kinds of things. I'm going to hit Y here, which will give me the Luma waveform controls. The Luma waveform basically allows us to read or adjust the brightness or contrast of our image, and that is useful during the first steps of what we call the primary colour grade, a grade that hits the entire image and carries out the first few steps of what we want to do. Now typically, Colorize, which we have at the top here, is a good option to have checked. If I want my waveform to be more visible, I can drag the waveform option to the right, and that will make my graph brighter, the white part of this graph down here brighter, or to the left, and eventually it will disappear. Generally speaking, about 2/3 of the way to the right is good, because it means that even the fainter parts of the reading are more easily visible. Graticule is the actual markings on the graph, the yellow horizontal lines and the two X and Y axes here. And if I drag Graticule to the left, I can make them disappear. I can increase their opacity. I usually drag these to about kind of only 1/4 up because I don't want them getting in the way of reading the scope's waveform. Now we're not going to deal with reference levels just for the time being, so do not worry about these. Now I can click outside of the window and it will close, and this scope is going to allow me to see the brightness information for the image I currently have in the viewer, which is currently a gradient, but I can also check a real image and you'll see the reading is very, very different. We're going to get to this in a few minutes, so back to the gradient for now. So this scope is allowing me to see the brightness information in this image, but how do we read this? We'll take a closer look at what it does. Now, don't worry too much about what I'm doing to the screen right now. If you want to know, Shift and F allows us to full screen the viewer like this, and I can right click and choose Show Scopes to bring up this hovering window with all kinds of information. Now I just want the one scope here. So in the upper right, I'm going to click the single frame icon. I'm going to make sure it's waveform, and for the sake of explaining this, what I want to do is I want to align it horizontally with the image. And this will become apparent why I'm doing this in just a second. But it's very useful for when we want to explain how all this works. So I've aligned my waveform and my scope so that they're on top of each other, and this is the easiest way to demonstrate exactly how the Luma waveform allows us to read the image. All of these scopes, well at least the two big ones, waveform and parade, give us a graph with two axes. We have the x-axis, and that is the x position, the horizontal position, of every single pixel in the image. And the y-axis is the brightness. The higher up, the brighter it is. The lower down, the darker it is. Now, the reason I teach using a grey gradient at first is that it illustrates the two axes almost perfectly. If I align the scope and the image like this, they immediately align horizontally. Everything on the left is on the left part of the graph or the scope. Everything on the right is on the right part of the graph or the scope. And what we see here is that I go from black on the left-hand side, which is 0, and the darkest colour we have, hence at the bottom of the graph, to white on the right-hand side. Then we get 1023, 1023, which is the brightest colour we can get in Resolve. It's pure white. So I'm going to move on to the next image just now. So here I wanted to really demonstrate the link between the X position on the image and on the graph. So here we've got 4 blocks where the gradient has been flipped. Notice now we have 4 diagonal lines because we have 4 instances of going from white all the way down to black, which is what creates this diagonal line. So as we can see, The two blocks in the center align with the two readings in the center, and the ones at the far left and right also align with the readings at the far left and right of the graph. And this is true of anything that moves, just like we saw before. You can see how the reading follows the block across the image. I'd like to make it absolutely clear that we only get X position on this graph, not Y. If this block were to move up or down, then the reading does not change because it is not moving horizontally. We get a slight little chatter because as pixels move, the values do change. And there's a very small little stalactite kind of, or stalagmite type reading in the lower left down here. That's just because of the border between black and white in an image which has been rasterized. That's more of an artifact of how this image was created, as opposed to kind of something you really need to be careful about right now. So the only way that we can be sure of vertical position of a region that we're looking at in our image is to cross-reference the scope with the image. I can see about halfway across the image I have something very bright, and lo and behold I have the very top of the reading here and the left hand side of the gradient, which is very, very bright. So that's how we have to do this. This is basically how the Luma waveform works. It allows us to go through and check our images based on contrast alone, and it will give us the horizontal position of every pixel plotted against its brightness to give us a scope that we can read. Now I can just close this down here, and now if I go back to my standard interface, it will reappear in the lower right. So we're going to move on to our real world example now, and it's worth pointing out before we go any further that if I make any adjustments to the image, then the scope will update in real time. We will get to our color grading controls in due time though, do not worry about that just now. Okay, so I have a task for you. I want you to go back to the short sequence that we conformed using the scene cut detector earlier on, and I want you to use this Luma waveform scope to read several shots throughout that sequence. In each case, what I want you to do is identify a bright part of the image and a dark part of the image. So as an example, I've got this shot up here, and I can see on the right hand side of my waveform I have a high reading. This is clipped out and a bit flattened. What I want to do is look at my image and go, okay, so on the very rightmost part of the image I'm looking for the brightest thing, and it's the white paint on this graffiti sketch back here. Then I want to do the same thing for the darkest part of the image. I'll go, okay, down in the center I have some quite dark readings. They appear quite low on the graph. It's probably the shadow in the dark parts of his eyes and in his mouth or under his chin, and they're reflected by the darker readings down here just at the center. Now, as long as we have the colorized checkbox we covered earlier checked, we can see the colors on our Luma waveform, and this can make things a lot easier to read. For example, I can tell that I have some bright blue readings here, and sure enough we have the kind of ocean blue colors in the graffiti in the background as well. If I click the abacus again and uncheck colorize, I just get a pure black and white image. Sometimes this can be easier to read, other times it's not. You can choose which one you want to use at any given point. Generally, in most images, colorize is more useful. So I want you to go ahead, go through 4 or 5 shots and read some important features. Look for the brightest thing, look for the darkest thing, and see if you can identify that on the waveform scope. Once you have done that, click on through to the next lecture. Okay, so now on to the next scope. We're going to talk about the parade scopes, and these are really important. They are more advanced than the standard Luma waveform, and in fact, once we know how to read them, we can actually use them in place of the Luma waveform for the most part, but we'll keep it simple for now. We've got different images to read. This time we have coloured gradients, and what we need to be able to do is that we need to be able to read the red, green and blue values of all of the pixels in our image. So first, let's look at bringing up the parade scope. Now that's as simple as going down to the drop-down menu we used in the previous lecture and choosing Parade. And what we will see is our parade scope that we had at the start of all of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the grey gradient and I will go full screen again. And I will show scopes, and this time I've got the parade. I have always got 3 full readings on my parade scope, and each and every one of them makes a full reading of the image. It is not like the left third is the left one, the centre third is the centre, and the right third is the right. That is not the case. All 3 of these scopes analyse the entire image, just like the Luma waveform did. And if I take a look at our real world shot here, you'll see I've got 3 full readings of the image, and that the shape looks a lot like the Luma waveform did as well, but we will get to this in due time. Now, this is all very similar to the Luma waveform, except it gives us different data to look at. On the left, we have the red channel, in the centre we have the green, and on the right we have blue. So if I just have red values in my pixels, then I have a line on the red graph on the left, and the other 2 are flat at 0. If I have green, it will be on the green graph. Now the reason I have a little bit of red here is that this is not a perfect primary shade of green that I've used. So there's a little bit of red in it as well, which is what will make it a little bit more yellow. But we'll talk about how colours combine in due time. And then we have blue, where the other 2 are at 0 as well. Now, the reason I have a grey gradient here, and this is one of the most important things to be aware of when using the parade scopes, is that if at any point the reading across all 3 channels is the same, let's say I've got 100 blue, 100 green, and 100 red, or anything else like that, what I get is a true neutral colour, either black, grey, or white, depending upon how bright it is. And this is really important. This is how I look at my image and how I can judge colour balance, and it's how I take the first steps towards solving colour casts in the image, so I can see that an image is perfectly neutral. So let's go back and take a proper look at our real world shot again. What I can see here is that I've got all kinds of different colours on the scopes, and only one thing in this image is neutral, which is the rightmost highlight on the painted shell up here. This corresponds with this flat reading across all 3 waveforms on the parade. Now remember, the parade gives us X against R, G or B value. So what we see on the right hand side is this peak here across all 3 waves. Remember, all 3 waves give us a full reading of this image. And this is really important, so I'm just going to pull back out of zoom again. If I make this image blue, if I push some blue into the highlights, you can see what was level now has more blue and green than red. Hence, what should be white is blue. So I can see both in the image and on my scopes that this image has a blue colour cast. The same is also true for any other colour. If there's more red, it's too warm. If there's more green, it's too green. Magenta, something's gone horribly wrong because you don't get a lot of natural magenta light. So this is how we can tell if an image has good colour balance, because the very top parts, the highlights, will be unbalanced. Generally speaking, highlights tend to be white and neutral. So let's just take a quick look at things in this image, and then you've got the same task as last time. So I want to make my viewer a bit bigger here. So to do that, I'm going to hold Alt and hit F, or Option and F if you're on Mac. And then I can just scroll in and middle click and drag around. So let's take a look at what we've got here. So I can see my white highlight on the right of my 3 scopes. Let's take a look at some other strong colours. Let's start with skin tones, because these are always the most important colours in the image. And it might be difficult to read the skin tones on this image because we have the purple shirt in the same kind of X area, horizontal area as the skin, but let's take a closer look. So I can see about 2/3 of the way across the frame we have the main character's skin tones, and lo and behold, I have some red peaks. I have some red readings which are more visible and higher up here. But I've also got quite a lot of blue, and that's because the purple shirt goes underneath the skin tones here. And purple contains both red and blue, which can make this difficult to kind of pick out. So let's just highlight this for a second and we'll take a closer look. Again, do not worry about the tool I'm using. This is called a power window, and we will go over this in plenty of detail later on. So now, if I take a look at the values in the skin tones, you can see we have all the shadows and everything down here, but we also have higher red values up here in the highlights than in the other color channels. So we can see here that higher red tends to mean skin tones. If I then change this and isolate some blue in the background, so the blue in the graffiti, you can see I've got a higher blue peak, and I might just need to bring my parade up to make that more visible, and you can see I've got higher blue values on the right here. And you can see over here I've got some green, and on the left, let's see if we can find a little spike of green on the left. It's not as visible because it's a darker value, but it is there. We can see down here we've got some green. Down here in that kind of shadowy area we have a spike of green compared to the other two channels. So we can begin to see how we can identify different key colors in our frame. So now you have the same task as last time. I want you to look through this sequence, pick out 4 or 5 shots, and read some key important colors using your scopes. I want you to pay special attention to skin tones. Always see if you can identify skin tones in your image, because like I will say this over and over again, they're the most important colors in the frame in your image almost every single time. So go and practice with this for a little bit and then click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Okay, so we can read contrast and we can read basic color balance using the Luma waveform and the RGB parade. We've got one more scope to cover before we get along to the fun stuff, and that is what we call the vector scope. Now, the Luma waveform allows us to read contrast. The RGB parade allows us to read RGB values and, by extension, color balance of our image. And the vector scope allows us to read both hue and saturation. So first, let's bring the vector scope up from our familiar drop-down menu. I'm going to click and choose vector scope, and I get this kind of clock face looking diagram in the lower right. So first, let's define some key terms. Hue is the actual color, red, green, blue, etc. And saturation is the strength of that color, or how colorful that particular hue is in whatever part of the screen we are looking at. Any true neutral color has 0 saturation. That's black, grey, white, it doesn't matter how bright it is. And if I go onto the grey gradient here, you'll see that almost nothing shows up on the scope in the lower right-hand side. So let's look at this scope and how we read it. So the first thing I want to make clear about the vector scope is that it does not give us any position information at all. So I'm going to do our little alignment trick. Now, there is no positional information on this scope whatsoever, X or Y, whatever. It only allows us to read both hue and saturation. So if I want to tell which part of the image has a particular hue or saturation, I'm going to have to do that by cross-referencing the image in my viewer with this scope. I cannot intuit where anything is by looking at the scope alone, which makes this different from the other two scopes that we've looked at. So let's talk through the anatomy of the vector scope and look at a few gradients and then finally a real image once again. I have a central crosshair, and then I have an outer border, and I've got 6 little targets, and they're labelled R for red, M for magenta, B for blue, C for cyan, G for green, and Y for yellow. These are the 6 vector hue indicators. Each one indicates either a primary or secondary colour, and we can have any number of different colours between two of these targets. You can see a white reading reaching out from the centre here, and the direction in which it is pointing denotes the hue. So the target that this reading is pointing towards is the hue. In this case, this white reading is going straight through the red target because we only have red hues in this image. And the distance the white reading reaches out from the centre of the scope is the saturation. The further out the reading goes, the more saturated the colour, and the less saturated the colour, the closer it gets to the centre. Now I've chosen another gradient here because it makes this very easy to see. On the left-hand side of the screen, we're at black, which has a saturation value of 0. And then we go all the way through to a very bright primary red with the maximum possible saturation for red in this colour space. And we have every single value in between, which is what creates this white line. If I quickly draw a window around this, and what we can see is if I drag to the left and exclude the more saturated parts of the image, the reading doesn't go out as far. But if I remove the other parts of the image, and I'll just make this a hard border, you can see what we're getting is that the white reading doesn't really start at the centre. We've got a very thin line which reaches down to the centre because of the border that this window is creating, but otherwise we just have the more saturated values. So the direction in which your reading is pointing is the colour, and the distance it reaches out from the centre is the saturation. So let's take a look at green. Now this one's just shy of the green target. It's not gone straight through the centre of the green target, and it's a little bit closer to the yellow target. We can see why on the left-hand side. And this corroborates with what we saw in the RGB parade exercise earlier. This is a very slightly yellow-green. It's not a perfectly primary pure green colour. So we can also see that corroborated here as well. And now for blue. Again, we've gone from the centre to the maximum saturation value, and the same here. This is a pure blue. It goes straight through the centre of the target. It starts at 0, goes out to the maximum possible saturation value. So this is fairly easy to read when we only have one colour. But let's take a look at what it looks like on a multicoloured frame. And here I have the standard radial gradient that I'm sure we've all made once in Photoshop. We always use this radial gradient tool and do this at least once. I certainly did. But it's quite a useful tool to show how hue and saturation are measured, and also presented on the vector scope. So we have basically every possible hue here, and they're all at their maximum possible saturation values. So the reason we have this kind of hexagonal outline, this kind of rupee from Legend of Zelda looking pattern here, is that we've started at red, but we can see we go to yellow and we get all the intermediary hues in between, all the different oranges and reds and yellows in between the two, and they're what describe this line. And then the same from yellow to green, and green to cyan, cyan to blue, and so on. We get all of the possible hues here, and they are all at the maximum saturation value, so we get them describing the kind of maximum limits of saturation we can see on this scope. So this outline, this hexagon, looks a bit skewed, and different colours have different possible values of maximum saturation, depending on the gamut in which we're working, and we will talk about gamut later on. So don't worry about it not being a perfect hexagon. This is kind of what we're looking at here. It's just hue, colour, and saturation, the strength of that colour. And just to hammer home that we don't get any position information here, if I make this spin, you can see we get little bits of glowing here as different colour values kind of dance around a bit, but it otherwise doesn't move. And that's because we don't get any position information on this scope, so no matter how this moves, this shape is not going to change. So let's take a look at a real shot. One thing that we might want to do, and we'll go over this again later, is to hold Alt or Option and hit F. And that's going to clear out the top half of our UI and give us much more space to work within the viewer, and thus get a much better view of our image. And I can just scroll in and drag the middle click to move this image around. This is a good way to work if we don't have an external reference monitor, but we'll go over those much later in the course. So I've got my image here, and what I will do is I will increase the saturation so that it's easier to read on the scope. We will go over all the primary controls in good time in the next section of the course, so don't worry about that. I've just increased the saturation to make it easier to read. And if I change the saturation, of course, like any other scope, the vector scope updates in real time. And if an image is black and white, you get a single dot right in the center. And if an image is very colorful, you get a reading that reaches further and further out from the center of the vector scope. So let's look at what we're seeing here. There are a few key things we look for with the vector scope. It's particularly good for skin tones, which we'll cover in a second. So I can see I've got a blue reading, a blue cyan reading reaching quite far out, a reasonably saturated blue cyan. That is all of the blue in the graphics on the wall, in the graffiti on the wall in the background. And we can see the range of different hues reaching out from the center here. That's what these represent. Very often, the things that look like a pure color are not. They're kind of between the two targets. That's normal. You don't have to get a lot of things right at a particular target. In fact, right through the blue target can look a little bit purple. It can look a little bit kind of magenta sometimes because we're seeing everything within the context of other colors in the frame, and we'll talk more about how that impacts color perception later on. I've got a red spike going quite far and right towards the red target, and that's the rose here on the left-hand side. I can see that it's a little bit pinkish, it's a little bit more blue and magenta, and sure enough, this red reading down here is not going straight for the red target, it's a little bit to the right. Now, I'll show you a trick which can make reading the vector scope a little bit easier. If I hit the abacus, what I can do is I can hit the checkbox here which says show 2x zoom. And when I do that, it will double the size of my reading. And this can make my vector scope much easier to read. But this can trip you up later if you forget that you've already zoomed in on it, so just keep this in mind. Now I've got a green leaf as well, and I've got a small green spike coming down here. It's a slightly bluish green. We can see the green spike is going off and kind of yawing out between green and cyan. And sure enough, I've got a bluish cool green up here as well. So that's how I can start to break down all of these different features that I see using the vector scope. Using this tool, I can quickly look at a color and go, that's a little bit weak. What I want to do is make it stronger, or, oh, that's kind of going crazy, I need to bring it down. I need to make sure nothing in the frame is going to be distracting, and make sure it's not going to disrupt the way we look at the image. If this red flower on the left-hand side here was super colorful, that would be really distracting. We wouldn't want that. So this is a really good tool to make sure that things are the proper color they're meant to be, and that they're not going to be a little bit too high or a little bit too colorful. And on the vector scope, this red flower here certainly does look too colorful. In fact, it's almost the most colorful thing on the image. Some of the skin tones here are just about equal to it in terms of saturation. Now, the last thing we're going to go over on the vector scope is the most important thing, and it's how to make a good reading of skin tones. Now, if I hit the abacus again, this little icon here, I can choose the skin tone indicator down here at the bottom. And if I do that, this little white line appears, and it's kind of 2/3 of the way or 3/4 of the way towards the red target. This is what we call the eye line, or the skin tone line. It indicates what is widely believed to be the ideal hue for skin tones in a film. Now, of course, that statement is ridiculous. There's no such thing as an ideal skin tone. And this is kind of an old idea. It used to be we stuck to it very rigorously. We don't anymore. Depending on the actual skin tones of the actor you're working with, you might go 15 degrees either north or south of this line. You're never going to go straight to the yellow target or straight to the red target, but we will stay within, let's say, 5 minutes if this is a clock face, maybe 5 minutes either side of this line, and that's all fine. It depends on what kind of skin your actor has. Now, there is no such thing as an ideal skin tone, but we do want things to fall close to this line, because if I change my hue and things go green or yellow, we start to see that really, really quickly. Skin tones start to look off if the hue is out very, very quickly indeed. as you can see here. And the reason for this is that skin tones are what we call a memory colour. Now we'll discuss that further in detail later on, but basically we can immediately spot when they're wrong, so we have to take great care with them. So we do want our skin tones to be within a small distance either side of the eye line, and depending on the colour of our background, what other colours are going on in the frame, we can get away with a bit more deviation from that line sometimes, but we'll talk about that much later on. So this has been a decent overview of the vector scope. It is one of the more abstract tools you use within Resolve. Once you get your head behind the kind of X-position brightness idea of the other two scopes, they're quite easy to read. But the vector scope is a bit weird at first because there's no position data there at all. So, and you know this is coming, I want you to go through and try to read a few of the shots you've got. Now they're all in log gamma, so they're going to be quite washed out and quite desaturated, which makes them difficult to read on the vector scope. So remember the abacus and the 2x zoom trick that we saw earlier on. That will make your shots much easier to read. I'm going to take mine back to normal because I've already increased the saturation here. And remember to turn 2x zoom off once you're done. So go ahead and click on through to the next lecture once you're ready, because we're finally going to start grading, and that is where all of the fun stuff begins.